Hello, thanks for watching. I'm Jim Falk, and today we're going to be talking about a danger that, and this may surprise you, touches every one of us. Disinformation. It represents a serious threat to our democracy, our national security, and frankly, our own well-being. This is especially worrisome as half of the world's population is going to the polls this year, making the need for trusted information even more important. Now, disinformation has been around for centuries, so I ask, why now the greater concern? Let's hear from our experts what they have to say about this and the steps that hopefully all of us can take to protect ourselves. Coming to us from the University of Texas at Austin is Associate Professor of Instruction, Michael Mosser. In addition to his teaching courses on European and international security, Dr. Mosser is the Executive Director of the Global Disinformation Lab, which I want to learn a lot more about. Lee McIntyre is a research fellow at the Center for Philosophy and History of Science at Boston University. He's also a senior advisor for public trust in science at the Aspen Institute, and the author of many books, including his most recent, which I have right here, on disinformation, how to fight for truth and protect democracy. Hello, gentlemen. Thanks so much for being with us. Really appreciate it. I'd like to start with you, Michael, because I think it's always helpful to have a definition to set the context. And let's go with, what is the difference between misinformation and disinformation?
It's the great question. It's the question to start with, obviously, and it's the one we spend a lot of time unpacking. Really, it's pretty basic. Misinformation is accidental. Misinformation is information that is untrue, but isn't necessarily purposefully spread. Disinformation is untrue information that is purposefully spread to harm others. You can find myriad examples of misinformation. Disinformation in the print era, if you really want to think about it that way, is the kind of infamous sinking of the Maine, right? And so a lot of the yellow journalism that took place in the late 1800s and early 1900s, before many of the press reforms that we put into place in the progressive era of the United States came into being, there was active disinformation being shown. And in the case of the sinking of the Maine, it was to enable the United States to go to war against Spain.
So, Lee, why is this such a big issue now? It seems like it's getting so much attention.
Well, it's a great question, and I love that you started with the definitional question, because that's the most important one. Not only that folks are talking about it, but that they're identifying it as disinformation. As you point out, it's been around for a long time, but it's important to note that if disinformation is a lie, then there has to be a liar, and we have to be able to expose who that is. Now, why is that more prevalent now? Maybe it's not. There have been liars around forever. I think the first conspiracy theory can be traced back to Nero. What's worse now, in particular, is the amplification. There have always been people with special interests who were served by not only lying, but creating an army of deniers who maybe would believe it and become polarized around that lie, and choose up sides, make teams. But that's now so much easier to do with the internet, because the internet allows one to amplify the lie as far as you'd like to go, and it makes it more virulent. And the other thing that we know from human psychology is that people are more likely to believe something if others around them believe it. And so it's not only faster to get to them, but they're faster to hear other people believing it and then want to jump on the bandwagon. And that's quite dangerous.
So both of you gentlemen speak a lot to the public about this issue. How do you respond to someone who says, hey, this is just a manufactured threat? Lee, take it away, and then we'll come. I want to hear what Michael has to say.
You mean that disinformation is a manufactured threat?
Yeah.
Well,
yeah,
that sounds like denial to me. And the interesting thing is that one of the most insidious things about disinformation is to cover up the fact that it's disinformation. So it doesn't surprise me a bit that these days, in fact, there is a coordinated denialist campaign against disinformation research.
Michael, is that some of the work that you do with your lab, is to really expose what disinformation is?
It is some of the work that we do. I always like to think of the work that we do at GDIL kind of with three verbs. We identify disinformation sort of worldwide. We analyze that disinformation, and we educate sort of students in how to do research on it, but also educate the public in how to identify, analyze, and then maybe even combat that particular kind of disinformation. I want to build on what Lee was saying earlier about a kind of the denialist campaign that's out there, because we see it not just in outright denialism, but this very subtle form of denialism that is generally expressed in a phrase something like, "Well, I'm just asking questions," right? And that's even more insidious in some ways, because there is a kernel of truth, right? Asking questions is not a bad thing, but if you use the phrase "I'm just asking questions" as a way to cover the denialism, to cover what you're really doing, where you're attempting to kind of subvert objective truth efforts, that's no less a form of disinformation than outright sowing, sort of full-on lies. And so you see the sort of spectrum of disinformation that goes from just 100% complete falsehoods to this very sophisticated planting seeds of doubt.
Definitely agree there. And in fact, it's been shown that some of the COVID denial was the result of a Russian disinformation campaign. This idea about there being tracking microchips in the COVID vaccines, the Wall Street Journal, based on some work at the Defense Intelligence Agency, traced it back to a propaganda piece in the Oriental Review in April 2020 that said that any future, because remember it's April 2020, any future vaccines developed in the West would have tracking microchips in them, courtesy of Bill Gates, who held patent 666 on that technology. The bottom of the article, share on Facebook, share on Twitter, which many millions of people must have done, because by May 2020, 28% of the American population thought there was something to this idea. What the article didn't say is that the Oriental Review is one of 4 English language propaganda arms of the SVR, used to be known as the KGB. So, there's a perfect example. The Russians have had a war against American science at least since Putin has been in office. Since, I think, before that, all the way back to AIDS, they've been spreading propaganda, disinformation, and it undermines science, but it can undermine other things as well. So definitely, there's been a number attached to this. I can't remember the source, but I think the estimate came out that of the 1 million people who died in the United States as a result of COVID, 200,000 of them were due to denialism, straight up propaganda that they believe. Not necessarily that story in the Oriental Review, but just overall lies that they heard from someone who knew that it was a lie.
I'm so glad you mentioned Soviet Union, Russia, because another book I read in anticipation of meeting with you is a book by Thomas Rid, Active Measures, The Secret History of Disinformation and Political Warfare. And this chapter that I just opened up to is AIDS Made in the USA. Michael, could you tell us a little bit about that story? Because I think what I found so interesting about it is the origin of the disinformation came from the Soviet Union, but then was, if you wish, manipulated domestically, and we're still feeling the effects of that campaign back in the early 80s.
Yes, that's it's a tragic story, and it really is a story. It's a story of its time, but it's also a story that continues to reverberate, right? And one of the things, and I'm glad you brought this up and asked the question the way you did, because I wanted to sort of amplify what Lee was talking about. At the time, Soviet Union essentially used American open society against it. And this is something we see playing out today across the world as well. Open society is a phrase that we often use to kind of as a shorthand for societies that are broadly democratic, that have freedoms of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of thought, essentially what you would think of as a modern consolidated liberal democracy. We call them open societies because they imply that there is a positive relationship between society and the state. That's a wonderful thing, but it also has some pretty big downsides. And one of the downsides is that freedom of information, because it's not state-controlled information, that freedom of information makes individuals individual arbiters of truth. And in some ways, the AIDS kind of disinformation of the 1980s was a precursor to the kind of things we see. This is pre-internet, this is pre-social media, but it played on the same underlying dynamics. You sow the seeds of doubt, you have and here's the funny part, and it's not haha funny, it's kind of ironic funny. It played on some real world tragic truths that the United States had gone through the 20th century, the Tuskegee experiment on Black airmen, the ways in which the United States has, over its history, kind of interacted with underrepresented populations in a way that was pretty horrible. So there is that sort of small kernel of truth that the AIDS story was then able to kind of leapfrog, or piggyback,
Magnify.
Yeah, magnify, exactly right. And so then, as Lee pointed out, that story becomes shared, that story becomes amplified, and it sets a stage for a general distrust, not just of American government, but also science more broadly, right? And you see that then play out about 40 years later with COVID, where people don't trust the science. And in fact, they say, not only do I not trust the science, the scientists are lying to me.
So, Lee, Michael has set it up perfectly for you to talk about First Amendment, which you talk about so compellingly in your book, because lots of people say the First Amendment gives us the right to write, read, talk about anything. How do you respond to that?
Well, here is the problem. The First Amendment, does protect us from government censorship. It protects us from the government telling us, you can't say that. There are some well-known limits. My daughter is a lawyer. She went over them for me one time. The number of things that the First Amendment does not protect. But I think what you're getting at here is the idea that some people are making the claim that any attempt to crimp down on disinformation through, say, content moderation on social media is nothing more than censorship. And I think that's baloney to make that sort of a claim, because, why is the First Amendment important? It's important because we need a free exchange of ideas to move toward the truth. So what do you do when you have bad actors, when you have frauds, liars, exploiting that free space to try to bamboozle everyone else to their detriment? It would be like saying, well, science is an open institution. Let's let the fraudsters come in. Let's let the flat earthers come in. Let's let everybody have a voice. So free speech does not necessarily mean that anybody can say anything that they want for any reason that they want, and there are no repercussions. And I've gone further than this, in fact, to make the claim that, in a way, disinformation is really the new censorship. If you have a closed society, you can censor the internet, you can censor the media, you can have state-controlled media. But what do you do in a society that's free? How do you pull the wool over people's eyes? It's hard to censor. Disinformation, I think, is a type of censorship. I go back to that scene. The analogy here I use is the scene at the end of Indiana Jones and the Holy Grail, or it's at Indiana Jones. I forget what it is, but it's the one with the Holy Grail, where he finally, and I'm not ruining the movie for anybody here, he finds the Holy Grail, okay? Indiana goes into the room, and there's the Holy Grail right in front of him, but he doesn't know which one it is because it's surrounded by 100 fakes. That is disinformation. It is the same purpose as censorship, to hide the truth. Sometimes you hide the truth by removing it. Sometimes you hide it in plain sight by surrounding it with BS. Disinformation is extremely dangerous. And, I think that there is reasonable content moderation that can happen. We should be protected from government censorship, if you want to think of it that way. As I understand it, the social media companies are free to take up or take down anything that they want for any reason. And they did for a while. There was that brief shining moment in about October 2020 when they put content warnings on about the election fraud, about COVID. People need to hear those sorts of warnings, I think.
Yeah, and that's such an important point, Michael. And I'm sure you're looking at that at your lab and some of the work that academics are doing. What type of restrictions should social media companies what type of restrictions should be placed on social media companies? Because they have a lot more freedom than, say, the Washington Post or the Dallas Morning News.
Yeah, and it's a version. So Lee used the analogy of Raiders of the Lost Ark. I'll throw the Spider-Man analogy out there. With great power comes great responsibility, right? We'll just pop culture the whole thing here, but this is social media companies do have an extraordinary amount of influence, and they have the ability to reach into segments of the population that traditional media never did. As I said earlier, social media is really, it turns individuals into editors in a way. We don't have the big three networks where Walter Cronkite is telling us this is, the United States lost the Vietnam War, and therefore, and sort of turning a fairly decent chunk of American public against it, even though that's a bit of a over exaggeration that he actually, caused us to pull out of Vietnam. But still, the big three networks exercised a huge amount of editorial control all the way through essentially the 1990s. The social media companies, as they replaced those sort of traditional news media outlets, the huge upside for this is that everybody has access to information that before was completely opaque to them. The big downside is these social media companies can relay that information in a way that, at the end of the day, it is, remember what we say, social media companies, right? And so these are profit-making enterprises. They are relaying information in a way that doesn't necessarily benefit the body politic. It benefits the company's bottom lines. And we are making individuals who are receiving that information responsible for making sense of that information, for making sense and for determining whether or not that information is true. And arguably, people don't have the tools. Media literacy is, we are woefully behind the curve on media literacy in the United States. We have accepted this tsunami of information washing over us without giving people the ability to swim. We tend to blame algorithms a bit more, or, sort of, we make algorithms the bad guy. Algorithms are value neutral, really. I mean, they are designed really, in a way to essentially be big heuristic shortcuts for the platforms. They do have the tendency, the side effect of amplifying beliefs and amplifying you see what you want to see, and that algorithm knows that. And obviously, but again, it comes down to the stories that are relayed to you for a reason, which is to keep those corporations, sort of making the profits that they have come to expect. And so the algorithm isn't really for you. It just has the effect of, it has the effect of working on you.
I think one thing we should remember, and I saw this anecdote when I watched one of your programs, and we'll put it up on our screen, about the conference that you held a few weeks ago in Austin. But one of your panelists at this conference on disinformation said, disinformation, think back to the 19th century where people in newspapers were selling drugs, quack drugs, and that was disinformation. And then we began to get regulation in the 20th century from the FDA and so forth, putting on some restrictions and about what you could advertise when we're talking about marketing a drug. So it's important, I think, to think about the profit motive in disinformation. And I wonder, Lee, if you could talk about that, because we tend to be thinking about politics, but it also comes down to dollars and cents.
Well, it does. I mean, the precursor for the really the modern science denial started with the tobacco companies in the 1950s, who were, hair on fire worried about this forthcoming study that was going to show a link between smoking and lung cancer. And they hired a public relations expert to come in and advise them. And he said, fight the science. And he meant through public relations. And they did that, and it was enormously successful. There's a terrific book about this by Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway called Merchants of Doubt. And one claim that they outlined how that worked. for tobacco, but also make the claim, which I think is correct, that that provided a blueprint for all modern science denial that came after. The fossil fuel companies followed that same blueprint. And I would make the argument that today's reality denial, not just denial about scientific facts, but about all facts about, is crime going up or down? Is the economy good or bad? What's the path of a hurricane, dare I say? Those sorts of things have become political, the source of political denial, following, not only using some Russian disinformation tactics, but following the blueprint that was set out by the tobacco companies. Money and power, those political power, those tend to be the great motivators here. And it is important to realize that the social media companies are profit-making enterprises, and they use the algorithms because they further engagement, and that's what they want. So maybe it's a side effect that they are so that they amplify so much disinformation, but they're very reluctant to change their algorithms, I think, because it's so profitable for the viewer engagement that they get.
Let's talk about Ukraine for a moment, because for a long time, and especially when you go and look at some of the history, Russia in particular, Soviet Union, was very clumsy about how they used disinformation. That doesn't seem to be the case anymore. And when you were talking about Ukraine, leaders on both sides of the aisle were talking about how some of the representatives in Congress and House representatives in the Senate were spouting Russian propaganda. Do you think that was happening? And if so, how do we prevent it? Michael?
Yeah, and it is an objective fact that Russian disinformation has made it all the way to the corridors of power in the United States. There are sort of reports that have come out, well-documented, well-researched reports that show that Russian disinformation has made it into briefing rooms in various committees, then that certain representatives in the US government have essentially fallen victim to a false narrative that they have then used in arguments on the floor of the House, factually untrue, and yet very powerful when amplified by a sitting member of Congress. The Ukraine story, broadly speaking, and the Ukraine narrative plays into so many underlying threads that we see in kind of contemporary international relations, right? The idea that Ukraine is a government of neo-Nazis, and that Ukraine is so woefully corrupt that all of the money that we would be giving them is going to buy. This is the 2 yachts story. If you want to be specific about what disinformation made it to the floor, that's what we're talking about. That President Zelensky has 2 yachts, and that if we give him money, sort of that he'll buy more yachts. That's disinformation. Mm-hmm. That is factually untrue, but it is a powerful narrative. It goes back, at least on the corruption side of things, there is a tiny bit of truth. Actually, on both of these, there is a kernel of truth to this.
How can we be more aware of when we are victims of disinformation, and then how do we protect ourselves?
I have a wonderful quotation from Hannah Arendt that I have up over my desk, which inspires me. She says, "If everybody always lies to you, the consequence is not that you believe the lies, but rather that nobody believes anything any longer. And a people that no longer can believe anything cannot make up its mind. It is deprived not only of its capacity to act, but also of its capacity to think and to judge. And with such a people, you can then do what you please." That last part is the chilling part, because that's where, even if someone doesn't believe the lie, they are so demoralized by the presence of disinformation that the autocrat, the authoritarian, the fascist can get what he wants. How do you fight back against something like that? You wake up, you realize that we're all potentially susceptible to disinformation, that there is a way to do it. You recognize the tactics, accusation in a mirror, the fire hose of falsehood. There are ways to learn. One of the best books I've ever read recently is The Handbook of Russian Information Warfare, a free book from the NATO War College The most important principle, I think, is that you cannot win an information war unless you realize that you're in one. We are already in an information. We're already at war with Russia and have been for decades. It is not at this point a kinetic war, but for the Russians, there's little distinction between a kinetic and an information war. And in fact, if they can achieve their objectives through information war without firing a shot, they will do so. The vast majority of the American public does not realize this, nor do they realize that one of the goals of Russian disinformation is to launder it as quickly as possible through domestic sources so that our brilliant cyber warriors cannot fight back. So what can we do to protect ourselves? Expose the plot, wake up, see that disinformation is all around us, and that when you feel that feeling in your gut that says, not just that might be true, but damn right, you might be being manipulated by disinformation.
Thank you both, gentlemen, for spending time with us, and want to encourage people to look at your website, Michael, with your lab, and of course, pick up a copy of On Disinformation, because disinformation is here to stay. Whether to sell a product, undermine a government, weaken democratic institutions, or a micro attack on a specific person or business, disinformation is not going away. Thank you so much for spending part of your day with us, where we talk about things that matter with people who care.